People are so good at, accumulating assets and really just kind of building up their fortunes. And then sometimes they forget about all the work that has to go on afterwards when you have to pass on the assets to the next generation or next of kin. So today we've got Susanne, our estate planner, on the line, and I'll let Susanne just briefly introduce herself.
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. It's great to be here. As Sheean said, I am an estate planner here at National Bank Financial. I work with Sheean's clients to do their estate planning, so reviewing wills and powers of attorney, trusts, etc. My background is as an estate planning lawyer. So before joining National Bank, I used to work at a law firm in Ottawa where I would draft wills and powers of attorney. And on the other side of the equation, I would also assist executors and family members after someone had passed away.
Awesome. Yeah, no, you've got quite the background. We're really happy that Susanne works with our clients. She does such a good job. Well, everyone always says such great things about you, Susanne.
Good to know.
So because this is a two-part series, there's a lot of stuff we're going to cover. We're going to talk about half of the stuff today. We're going to start with, prior to dying or passing away and starting to pick that executor or who's going to follow through on the will and everything. And then in the next webinar, we'll talk about kind of what are the real duties of the executor. So why don't we jump into our first question here, Susanne? When picking an executor, who can be that person?
Excellent question. This is a question that a lot of clients sort of default to kind of three different areas of individuals that they would choose. The first are family members, which is a pretty obvious one. Then sometimes clients will look to other professionals like lawyers and accountants. And then finally, an area that most clients are not as aware of is the use of a professional corporate executor or trust company. So going to the family side seems pretty obvious that, you would choose your spouse or you would choose your children. And in a lot of cases, this does make sense. But what we want to avoid is the default, sort of the defaulting to this without giving some more thought as to why you're choosing these people. So for example, a spouse seems like an obvious choice, but if you're getting a little bit older, maybe that spouse will need some assistance. So, this is something that you want to think about a little bit. For children, if you're, you want to leave your estate to your kids, so you're going to have your children as the executors. The main thing that I see that creates issues is choosing children who do not get along. So an estate administration is not the time to bring the family together. If anything, you see the opposite happen. So that's the biggest key. The other things that I see clients not really giving much thought to is, what do your children actually do for a living? So acting as an executor requires both time and expertise. So if you have a child who is very busy with their career, with their family, is it really fair to them or to your other beneficiaries to put them in charge of the estate when what really ends up happening is they have another job that they're being asked to do? On the expertise side, it's really important that your executors be detail-oriented and financially savvy. So what that means is you don't need to have an executor who has a PhD or an advanced degree or anything like that, but you need to have some level of being able to track, assets coming in, expenses, and you need to be good at the paperwork side of things. So on an anecdotal level, when I've worked with executors, I've noticed teachers, especially administrative professionals, are very, very good at acting as executor because of those skills of keeping track of everything, keeping things in order, making sure deadlines are adhered to.
Yeah, that's really funny actually that you would say an administrative person would be great at this job, but you're right. It's a lot of just tracking and finding and all that, right? Exactly. And even with like the complexity of some of these, I mean, sometimes, if it's just basic, then yeah, it could make sense and someone can do it. But I guess there's other times where it's a little bit more complex and say there's corporations and trusts and whatever, then they have to think about maybe possibly getting these other professionals involved, correct?
Yes, exactly. So that's something we'll talk about a little bit more down the road, is that the executor doesn't have to do everything personally, but let's say a family member is maybe not the best choice. Sometimes clients will then think about, okay, well, I've got this really great accountant, or I've got this really fantastic lawyer who's been part of my growing business for the past, 20 years. They would be an excellent choice for executor. And again, it is something that in some cases does work, but requires a little bit more reflection. This is because, again, an executor can consult a lawyer and accountant dealing with certain aspects of the administration. So in my role, when I was a lawyer working in private practice, I would really help with the probate application. That's something that clearly needs legal expertise. But as we talked about, a lot of the work that needs to be done is administrative in nature. And so you need to think about, is a lawyer really or an accountant the best person for that? And the reason being that lawyers and accountants are going to charge a fee, obviously. And so you need to give some thought to, how are those fees going to work? If you think about, for example, part of the role of the executor is going into the house and sorting through personal effects. Do you really want your accountant to be doing that at his or her hourly rate? You need to think about that a little bit, right? That doesn't really require that level of expertise. So maybe you don't need a professional to be taking over that entire role. So that's something that you would want to think about. How much is it going to cost to have a professional? And what's the estimate? Again, most accountants and lawyers will charge an hourly rate. So you want to get sort of an estimate as to what would be the overall fee. And the other thing that clients sometimes forget about is that lawyers and accountants, maybe not as often as other professionals, will eventually retire, right? So they're not always going to be in that role. What happens then? Are you okay with having someone else in the firm take it over? Or was that relationship really with that individual? And if that's the case, well, then you might need to do a little bit of tweaking there and thinking things through a little bit more.
I think it's really important. You touched it, nailed it on the head. Your lawyer charging $200 an hour goes and does a 5-hour fact-finding mission for you, and that's $1,000, right? That's can be very expensive. Mm-hmm. And again, the other part is that people retire, right? So again, make sure you pick someone that is going to align with what you want to get done. So there is one other option, correct? To choosing an executor.
Yeah, and so this is an option that some clients are aware of, but is not as well known, and that's the use of a professional executor or a trust company. So what this is it's a professional company that will actually act in the role as executor. So these trust companies are mostly owned by the banks in Canada. So for example, at National Bank, we have National Bank Trust, or the legal name NatCan Trust Company. So what this is it's actually a team of professionals with differing backgrounds. So we've got admin people, there's trust officers, there's lawyers, and there's accountants. All that they do is deal with estates, essentially, or trusts. So their experience, they do this on a volume basis. They're also a neutral choice, which is sometimes not the case when you have a family member or even a lawyer and accountant. That's quite close. And so this is a good choice if a client does not have a family member or a professional that would make sense, or if the estate is extremely complicated. So those are the pros. Everybody always wants to know, so why doesn't everyone appoint a trust company, right? Yeah. Sounds fantastic, And that is, most people are driven away by the cost. So again, an accountant or a lawyer charges at their hourly rate. We'll talk a bit about how even family members can charge compensation. What a trust company will do is they will put their fees up front. So you'll see right away what it is in terms of what the estate will actually cost for executors' fees. So I can only speak to the fact of what National Bank Trust charges, because that's our trust company. And at NatCan, it is a 4% a fee based on the value of the assets, and then depending on how large the estate is, it's a sliding scale that goes downward. So 4% is the maximum, and there's a minimum fee of $20,000 no matter how large the estate is. So for most people, for most average estates, usually you end up between 2.5% and 3% of the value of the estate. For a lot of clients, that's a lot to swallow. That's a big number right off the bat.
Especially if you have $5 million.
It can start to add up, right? Absolutely, for sure. And that's the thing to keep in mind, though, is that as we've talked about, a lawyer, an accountant, even a family member can charge compensation. The other side of it is that even if an executor is not charging compensation for what they're doing, we just talked about, you know, family members are not necessarily going to be able to do all of this work themselves. They're going to have to go to professionals anyway. And so by going to a trust company, everything is more or less done in-house or outsourced within a in-house. So what you're doing is you're paying for the convenience of having everything taken care of in one place.
Yeah, and I think it's pretty obvious that, you know, a more complicated estates should generally go to a professional to seek help. We typically see people that have very simple estates, they'll have a family member do it. But remember, we are talking about splitting money here. And I mean, let's take my perfectly good relationship with myself and my brother. Who knows how our relationship could change if there was something that would, you know, like money, and it can change something. So there's always things to consider. You talked about fees for the trust company. Do you want to just kind of touch on, like, even if you've got your family member to do the estate and be the executor, how much would they typically charge, or how much would you expect someone like that to typically charge for being an executor?
Absolutely. So this actually brings up a really good planning point for those clients who are actually updating their wills. Essentially, your will determines what the compensation will be. So first choice is always whatever is set out in the will. Now, unfortunately, what I see quite a bit is that this topic isn't discussed very much, especially among family members. So what ends up happening is a very generic clause, in most cases, is added in there. And it'll say that the executors are entitled to reasonable compensation. So what's reasonable mean? Well, we have to turn to sort of what the courts have decided in the past. And again, of course, nothing is ever straightforward in these types of scenarios, but the standard rule of thumb is 5% of the value of the estate. So 2.5% of anything coming in, 2.5% of anything going out. And then it's adjusted upwards or downwards depending on how large and complicated the estate is, and sort of what the results are and how long it took. So that's a lot of nebulous factors, right? So what actually ends up happening is the executor will make a claim. They'll say, based on all of this, I want to take 4.5%. That goes to the beneficiaries, and it's up to the beneficiaries to say yes or no. So you can already start to see where this might create a little bit of could create a problem, right? Because the more the executor takes, the less there is for the beneficiaries. Totally. So executors make a claim. If the beneficiaries accept it, fantastic. If the beneficiaries don't accept it, it goes back and forth with the court kind of being the final arbiters of that. So, you know, again, having from a planning perspective, it's important to give some thought to this and to perhaps put something in your will. When you're choosing an executor, it's important to think about, if you don't address this question in the will, perhaps your executor and your beneficiaries are going to have to fight it out. Trust company will have, you know, will give you what the fees are going to be upfront. A lawyer and accountant will give you hourly rates. And if you're an executor, one of the things that you need to do is double check, what are the potential provisions for compensation and do they make sense for me?
Totally. Yeah, no, that's a lot of good information. I wanted to also just hint on something here, and I don't think you touched on it, but if you do appoint an executor that is someone as a family member, you can also have a trust company help those people. Correct?
Absolutely. So in some cases, what ends up happening is the executor, as I talked about, might be extremely busy and they just don't have the time and the resources to do everything personally. So what we have seen at NatCan Trust is that they will actually hire a trust company to act as agent, which is essentially the trust company does all of the day-to-day administrative work and then also provides guidance on this is what I think the next step should be, this is what you should do, and then the executor always remains the one that's responsible and legally liable, but they'll be able to say yes or no and be consulted on big decisions that need to be made. So this can be an option for people who do not have, who maybe are not comfortable with having a trust company appointed as executor, but who may want to have that option for their children in case their children, for example, don't have all of the time and money in the world in order to do this themselves. Yeah. I do want to bring up another planning point on that as well, though, is that if you're considering doing something like this for your children, I mean, your children at the end of the day will decide, but it's also important to have something in your will that says that A, gives them this option, and B, is very clear on where payment for the trust company will come from. Is it from the estate? Is it going to come out of the executor's compensation? What's going to happen there? So those are some other important issues to consider, even if you don't want to make the decision of having a trust company involved right away.
It seems like a pretty complicated decision, and it is. It can take a lot of thought, and we're actually here for you all. If you ever want to just chat and have this conversation about who should be the executor, who fits us best, it's not a decision you should make in 2 seconds. It's a decision that you should be relatively thought out. Okay, so we're available for you guys. Now, let's go on to the next part here. Let's talk about, so you've already chosen your executor, sorry. Now you've passed away. So what is the first step that the executor has to do?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can't take it for granted that, hopefully the person who's passed away has met with all of us to make sure that they've considered all of the different options and they've planned their estate. But you can't take it for granted that that's what's been done. So one of the most important things to do after you arrange, the funeral, burial, cremation, etc., is to read the will to make sure you understand what's being asked of you, and also to make a very careful inventory. What are the assets and what are the liabilities? So sometimes where executors will get into trouble is they will start trying to administer the estate right away, by which I mean they start paying off credit card bills, they start giving out money, things along those lines, without truly understanding what the entire situation is. The problem is that if you are in an estate where it is unclear or it's possible that there might be more liabilities than assets, you want to know about that beforehand, because if you do not and you start acting under the estate and there's not enough money to satisfy everyone and you haven't taken proper precautions, you may end up being personally liable for some of those debts. So I cannot emphasize enough the importance of truly making inquiries and understanding what needs to be paid off before you distribute any assets. And by this, the largest creditor out there, don't forget about CRA. That's very, very important. When you meet to do an estate plan with our team, one of the things we talk about is income taxes and how that can really impact the final value of an estate. If you're acting as an executor, it's extremely important that you have a good understanding of what is owed before you actually start distributing anything.
So it's really important, I guess, that first thing you do is you make sure that the burial or cremation is all taken care of. And the second thing you're going to do is you're going to read the will and understand what the will is asking you to do. And the third thing that you're going to do is you're going to make sure you inventory everything, because it is important, like Susanne said, liabilities plus assets, right? So thank you very much for that question, for that answer, sorry. Let's talk about like how long does this process take from start to finish? Person dies on, say, December of this last year. Now, where are we looking to finish this thing off?
Yeah, so this is another common misconception. People think that within a few months everything's going to be wrapped up. I would say even for the most simple estate, you're looking at least a year before things are fully wrapped up. That's because of a number of different reasons. The first is, like I said, income taxes. So income taxes are usually due the later of 6 months or April 30th after the person dies. So you've got a little bit of time there before you have the final income tax return. The other issue is probate. So for a lot of estates, and we'll talk about this in our next seminar, we'll talk about what probate means. But the key here is that depending on where you live, probate, once you actually apply, may take a number of months or longer. I've seen in Toronto, some people saying that it can take a year before probate is obtained. And so the issue there is that an executor can't actually deal with those assets under probate until you get that certificate. So again, another planning point, important to make sure you understand how probate will impact your estate. But if you're already acting as executor, you need to just be clear about the fact even a simple estate is going to take at least a year because of all of these different factors. And then if you think about it from a practical perspective, depending on what kind of assets you have, so if you have a house, depending on where you live, and the GTA might be pretty simple to sell a house within a few days. But if you live in a more remote area, maybe it takes a little bit longer. So these are all factors that you need to keep into account. And this is something, if you're acting as an executor, it's important you understand what these time limit or sort of how long this might take. Yeah. And that you communicate this with the beneficiaries, because if this is the first time you're encountering it, the odds are the beneficiaries don't know about this either. So, and that's going to be part of the important duties of the executor is regular communication with the beneficiaries to avoid problems.
Let's just take a little other step back there, talk about timing again. So I've heard people say that, an estate takes, it can take a year, but sometimes you hear about people that have dragged them on for a very long period of time. Is there a time limit on when to finish one of these things?
So I'm going to give you the very lawyerly answer of right? There's of course no hard and fast rule. What we're looking at is reasonableness again. So has the executor acted reasonably? So if you're waiting for months and months for a court to get back to you about probate, that's outside of your control. If it takes that long, it takes that long, right? So it's reasonable that there's going to be a delay. On the other hand, let's say I'll use the house example because that's pretty concrete. If you haven't gotten around to securing the house, in 4 months just because you've been busy, well, that's not reasonable, right? You take on the role of executor. What you need to do is act in a reasonable way to make sure that all the assets are protected and that debts are paid and that you've distributed the assets to the beneficiaries. So it's going to depend on each circumstance, but as long as you can justify why something has taken longer, and if it's a reasonable reason as to why it's taken that long, again, going on vacation or, just not getting around to it or being too busy is not a reasonable excuse. In some cases, yes, it may take years and years and years, but there's no hard and fast rule as long as the executor is acting reasonably.
And is there a penalty, possibly?
Right. So for some aspects, right? So the big penalty would be CRA, right? They want their final tax return. There's a certain due date. If you don't pay by that due date, there's going to be interest and penalties that are available. If you are dragging your feet on distributing assets to a beneficiary, there may be interest that's payable if you're taking too long and there's no reason why you're not paying assets out. Or if you've done something like, for example, it's winter time and you didn't double check to make sure that, the pipes were protected and they burst and they freeze and burst and there's damage. Well, if you could have done something to prevent that, you might be on the hook personally to fix it, for example.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah. So again, if you're not acting reasonably to preserve and protect, you might be on the hook personally for any damages that result.
Right on. So I guess I'll reiterate the points here. So first, burial and cremation. Second, you're going to, you're going to, what are you going to do next? You're going to do an inventory of everything, right?
Yeah. And
once you have the inventory done, you can actually pop. Oh, so there's the last part of this. Sorry. And that is, you've done your inventory, you've looked at everything, and I'm the executor, say, and I'm like, oh my God, this is way too hard for me to do. Can I go and seek help, or do I have the possibility to opt out of this arrangement? Tell me more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So probably after this conversation, everyone is going to say, there's no way I want to be anyone's executor. So that's reasonable. So yes, an executor can seek help. As we kind of talked about beforehand, you don't have to do everything personally. Ultimately, you're the one responsible, right? So any decisions that are made are still your decision, but you can seek appropriate help with that. With any decisions that have to be made, right? So you can hire a company to go out and make sure that the pipes aren't going to freeze, things along those lines, right? You can take those steps. You don't have to personally be out there, wrapping up all the pipes and things like that. On the other hand, if you decide that really this is too much work for you, no one can force you to act as an executor. Okay, so that's kind of the main point there. But it's very important. The timing of when you make that decision is extremely important. So you can't get 6 months in doing all of this work and then suddenly decide that you don't want to do it anymore. That's why those first steps of, inventory, making sure you understand what's in the estate, making sure you read the will and understand what is expected of you, making sure you understand how compensation works, that all needs to be part of your thought process before you actually decide not to do anything. So again, dealing with things like a funeral or a burial, that's likely not going to create an issue. But if you start showing up at banks and saying, hi, I'm the executor, please pay this money out, and then it turns out there's not enough money to pay off other creditors, well, it's going to be extremely difficult for you at that point to back out and say, yeah, no, actually, I have nothing to do with this. Especially once you get to the point of applying for probate, that's sort of a do or die, right? If you go through the step of actually applying to the court to hold yourself out as executor.
Oh. Suzanne, I think we lost you. That's okay.
Sorry, I beeped out there for a second, but from a planning perspective, so from a planning perspective, it's extremely important that you know who you're going to appoint, that you speak to that person, and you make sure that they're not going to renounce, right? So this is, again, why the beginning of this presentation, we spent so much time going through what the different options are, because you need to give some thought to this, because you don't want to end up in a situation where the executor says, nah, no, thank you, I'm out. So again, can't be forced to do it, but you need to really carefully consider at what point you're going to renounce, and the sooner you do it, the better.
Right on. Well, we've been about 30 minutes here, so I want to just kind of reiterate those steps. So first step, you're gonna arrange the burial or cremation. Second step, you're gonna read the will and see what it is that is asked of you to do. Third thing you're going to do is you're going to see what the executor compensation is and take an assets and liabilities of and track them all and do an inventory of everything. And then the last decision that you have to make is, are you going to do it, yes or no? So I guess our next part of the presentation, we'll talk about if you say yes and you're going to do it, this is what you have to do next. So there's a lot of different moving parts here. It's such a large topic. We would love to have a conversation with you if this is something that is on your mind and you keep thinking about, because this is a process that's not, you don't just make these decisions overnight. It does take quite a bit of thinking, in my opinion, to do. So on that note, Susanne, did you want to add anything else before we adjourn?
I think you summarized it very well. Yep.
Fantastic. So what we'll do is we'll have part 2 in 2 weeks, and we'll finish off with the series here on choosing and being an executor. Thank you very much, everyone, and we'll talk to you soon.